Welcome to section 3.1. Now in 3.1 we're going to focus on community ecology. Now if you guys remember, this idea of community is just going to be a group of populations, so a group of interbreeding members of a species that are together. And so because they're in the same spot at the same time, they're going to be forced to interact, and that's going to be predation, that's going to be competition, that's going to be symbiosis. All these things we've talked about previous. And so as these things interact, we want to delve a little bit more deeply into some of the things that affect whether or not they can continue to grow, some of the things that affect who ultimately is going to be living in that community at any given time. So with that idea, let's discuss the idea of what limits growth. Now, anything that's limiting growth is going to be called a limiting factor. And there's various ways that you can try to limit growth. You can obviously have where individuals are just dying, and so their numbers are kept lower. You can have where you are going to have fertility issues. So if you start to have too many individuals, or if something else happens to be present in large enough amounts, you could have where individuals are going sterile, or they're having a harder time conceiving, or you could have where the infant mortality rate's higher, so it's harder to get the children to adulthood. You can also have limiting factors that could be like wind, where it prevents you from spreading out. If you're a plant and you can't get your seeds to another location, let's say you're on an island and there's other islands around, if you can't get your seeds to those other islands, then you can't continue to spread. Your growth is restricted to that one island. So don't think this is just about killing things off, that this is just about the idea of losing your life. There's other stuff that can be affected, such as fertility and just getting from one place to the next. Now, as far as what can be a limiting factor, just about anything. You can have biotic limiting factors where there's a predator that's ultimately killing a bunch of you. You can have where there are abiotic factors that could be chemicals that make you sterile or infertile. It could be chemicals that are poisoning you and limiting your lifespan. It could be that there's just the temperature is kind of off, and so you have difficulty moving into new areas because the temperature is too cold there. It could be a lack of sunlight in some or all areas. Maybe you can only grow in certain parts where there's not tree cover, because once there's tree cover, you can't get the light. So there's all kinds of stuff that can ultimately make an organism shift from growing, being successful, and living down to this area where at least some of the individuals are dying, or they're more incapacitated, or they're having a harder time reproducing and continuing on. Now, tied in with this idea of limiting factors is your range of tolerance. This is pretty much what it sounds like. So a range is just like a region, a spectrum. And tolerance is what you can ultimately get by with, what you can manage to, I don't know if you'd say ignore, but what you're able to kind of survive despite. And so with this range of tolerance, this is going to be kind of your limits as an organism, as a species. So if you look at something like temperature, if it gets really, really hot, people cannot tolerate it. At some point, we start to overheat and we can die from heat stroke, heat exhaustion. At some point, if it gets cold enough, especially if as a person you don't have the luxury of the clothes and everything else that protect us artificially, you would ultimately freeze to death, hypothermia. And so this is no different for other animals. So this one here is just showing steelhead trout, so just a type of fish. This is a common game fish that people try to catch. And so these guys can survive in this optimal range. This is the range where they are essentially happiest, all right? This is where they're doing great. And so this optimal range here you can see is from 13 degrees Celsius to about 21 degrees Celsius. Now, when it gets a little bit warmer or colder, it's not as though they instantly die. What happens is now they're starting to get stressed. Much like if you're in a classroom and the heat isn't turned on properly, and so it's cold, not I'm gonna die cold, but I really notice it's cold a lot, and so I'm kind of shivering and I'm trying to hug myself, and I'm going to go through all these motions, and that's going to distract me from being able to do my schoolwork. It's going to distract me from talking to my friends. It's going to distract me from doing the normal things that I do to get by. And so in these stress zones, it's not so much that you're dead, but it does affect how often you die. You're more likely to die. You know, little things, illnesses, etc., can creep up more often. So you're more likely to die and you're less likely to reproduce. If you're pretty cold, you're not necessarily thinking about reproduction. You're probably thinking about getting warmer. You know, if you were hungry, you're probably going to think about food, not necessarily stuff like reproduction. So in these zones of stress, you'll see that you're going to get fewer individuals because more of them are dying and fewer of them are reproducing, but they're not gone. You can still see some individuals. It's just rarer. And then eventually you get out here to 25 degrees and 9 degrees where it's the zone of intolerance. This is where you cannot survive. So if we get out to those extremes, too hot or too cold, there will be no steelhead trout. They cannot survive in those temperatures. So if we're trying to figure out where organisms can be, where they ultimately might be found, we can use these range of tolerances to try to figure out, all right, is this the right temperature? Is this the right pH? Is this the right amount of sunlight? And by looking at those things, it makes it easier to kind of figure out where stuff might be located and to figure out where stuff cannot be located. Now, the last thing we have here is this idea of ecological succession. Now, this is just where in a particular ecosystem, you see a shift in who's living there. So starting off, let's say there's something bad that happens. So we have this forest, right? This is what's called a climax community. And this forest is happy and healthy, and there's big trees, and there's understory plants, and there's all kinds of animals living there. It's very biodiverse. It's a wonderful place. But these species don't end up living there forever, because what happens is if you give it enough time, there's typically some type of a disturbance. In this case, it's a fire, forest fire. And when that disturbance happens, it's going to change who's there because the species that were there are driven off or killed. And so now we've got this dirt, we've got this kind of open canvas to do a new painting. And so you're going to see there's certain organisms that do a really good job of moving in fast. And so they weren't found there before necessarily. So you've got some grasses, you might have some mosses, you might have herbs, things that grow rapidly, things that tend to live short lifespans, like maybe a year, annual plants we call those. They're going to rush in there and populate, and so you're going to see just carpets of these plants. But these plants can't compete well with other plants. So their whole strategy is get in early, get in quick. But then we're going to start to get shrubs. We're going to start to get faster growing trees. These plants will start to take hold and they'll start growing and they're going to overshadow these plants that got there initially, these faster, smaller plants. And as this happens, that changes the food sources. So the animals that are living here, they're going to start to shift. So we're going to get this change in what species are present over time. And then eventually you're going to start to see these more mature, longer growing, bigger trees will start to grow along with these faster growing trees. And so eventually these faster growing but shorter trees will get overtaken by the mature trees and we'll get back to what we call that climax community. But this is going to take quite a while. Depending, this could take anywhere from close to 100 years, I'd say, on the short end, to thousands, if not tens of thousands of years on the long end, depending on how fertile the soil is, depending on how bad the disturbance was, depending on how cold it is, so how easy it is for plants to grow. So this process will take a while before we get back to this climax community. And in between, you'll see there are lots of different species that you will not find once we get to the climax community. They're gone. They do not live there anymore. Now there's two basic types when we talk about ecological succession. There's primary and secondary. They'll both be similar in terms of there's some disturbance, there's going to be this progression of species over time. But the difference is going to come down to what happened in that disturbance. Now, if we're looking at a severe disturbance, like a volcanic eruption, a landslide, something that exposes bare rock, this is what stage one is. This is bare rock. This is going to be primary succession. So primary succession starts out with rock, no soil. And so what happens is you're going to get these early species that move in that we are going to call pioneer species. These are going to be things like moss. This is going to be things like lichen. These guys don't need soil to grow. They can actually help break down the rock to get nutrients. And as they die, their decomposing bodies start to build up soil, which then allows grasses and herbs to move in. And then as those guys grow and die off, you can now get shrubs. Eventually you can get fast growing trees, slower growing trees that get bigger. So eventually we'll get there, but it takes time, and you can see this kind of top layer as we build up the soil. And you can see the soil keeps getting more and more as time goes on, as bigger and bigger stuff is decomposing and being turned into soil, until towards the end we have a healthy, mature community. But with primary succession, this is going to take a long time, because that process of building up soil could take itself thousands of years in some cases. In really inhospitable environments, that could take millions of years. So primary succession will usually take a pretty good chunk longer than secondary succession would take, because you don't have the soil. You need this step with the pioneer species to make soil. Now, with secondary succession, this is when something happens. So it's not like a volcanic eruption. This is more like a forest fire, or somebody comes through and tills the soil for farming. So everything that's there kind of gets wiped out. If that happens, we still have our soil. So it's kind of like, instead of going back and starting from climax community to bare rock, we're essentially going to be starting somewhere in these first stages here, like the more 2-3 stage, where there's already at least some soil present, if not a good chunk of it. And so we can start right off with the grasses. We can start right off with the annual plants and the herbs. We get to skip that pioneer phase. The rest of it is pretty much identical though. You're still going to go through the same steps. It's just a shortcut because you're not going all the way back to the start. When you're talking something that is primary, it's going to occur right at step 1. Whereas if it's secondary, it's going to start out much further on. And if you look at this graph up here, what I like about this is it shows you that initially the species that are present will start to lose, they'll start to disappear as newer species come in. So you can see the one species, and this would be a variety of plants and animals, these guys thrive early on. But then as bigger plants, bigger animals tend to move in, those guys start to be successful, and the earlier guys can't compete as well. And so they start to either diminish in numbers or go extinct in that area. They have to hopefully find another area that's doing succession as well, and they'll just kind of move over there, if you will. And then the second species, they start to thrive, but then eventually you start to get these slower growing but more hardy plants that move in. And so then you see these guys that are 3 start to kind of pick up, and then that means you see the decrease in 2. So this is what we mean when we say this gradual transition of species that are present, because many of these species that are like 1 or 2 at these earlier stages, they will not be present later on. Their time to shine is only going to be a window of maybe a year, maybe 20 years during this succession process, where conditions are right for them to live, either because their food source is present, or because they're able to get enough light, or because there's not much competition that's there that they have to worry about.